What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. It is Thursday, which means we got some football today, but that also means that I needed to get you guys my must-start and must-sit players here in week 2 of the fantasy football season. I got 8 guys total for you across the wide receiver and the running back positions. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video, and let's start talking about these must-start players before we talk about the must-sits. So the first player that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Malik Nabers as a must start against the Washington Commanders. Now, last week, Nabers caught 5 passes for 66 yards in his first regular season game as a New York Giant, and this Washington defense gave up 51 fantasy points to the Buccaneers last week. So they gave up a ton of fantasy football points. It was the most in the NFL, and playing a wide receiver in your fantasy football lineups that's going to be attached to Daniel Jones after last week's performance probably seems scary, but the performance we got out of Nabers in the previous week does feel like that is the floor of his fantasy football production. Now, in a game here on the road, New York will have to remain competitive, and Nabers should eat up this weak Washington secondary. So all things considered, I think we can plug Malik Nabers into our fantasy football lineups, and I think we can view him as a safe wide receiver 2 here in week 2. Now, the second player that I think you should be starting at the wide receiver position is going to be DeVonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. He gets a game this week against the Atlanta Falcons, and last week, DeVonta, he caught 7 of his 8 targets for 84 yards in a 34-29 win over the Green Bay Packers there in Brazil in week 1, and this week's matchup against Atlanta looks worse on paper than it actually is. Even though Atlanta is currently ranked 5th against wide receivers right now, it's only because they played a very low scoring game versus the Pittsburgh Steelers last week, and Justin Fields threw 0 touchdowns. They actually didn't even score an offensive touchdown in that game. So this does look like a tougher defense on paper than it actually does, but keep in mind it was just week 1, so those numbers don't necessarily mean a ton. Now, this secondary, it is weaker than it seems. The only risk that I see here is that DeVonta Smith and the Eagles, maybe they get off to a hot start. They get a lead early in this game, and Atlanta kind of looks like they looked last week. If that is the case, there is a chance that they get that early lead and they kind of grind out the second half with Saquon Barkley on the ground instead of passing the football. But I'm not too worried about it. DeVonta Smith in this Kellen Moore-led offense, he is eating already. We've already seen positive signs of it. I think he is a must-start for us here this week, and I would feel more than comfortable calling DeVonta Smith a top 20 play at the wide receiver position and somebody that I feel like I have to get into my starting lineup. Now, moving on to my must-start running backs, let's talk about Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. He gets a game here this week in week 2 against the Dallas Cowboys on the road there in Dallas. Now, last week, Kamara, he rushed 15 times for 83 yards and a touchdown in that Saints week 1 victory over the Carolina Panthers, and he additionally hauled in all 5 of his targets for 27 yards in that game as well. Now, obviously, that game wasn't very competitive. Dallas is currently ranked 18th against fantasy football running backs, and that's kind of somewhat surprising considering the blowout that they had last week against the Cleveland Browns. I think the issue is that Dallas, even though they had a positive game script that should have allowed the running backs to kind of be taken out of that game there in week 1, they did allow Jerome Ford to catch 6 passes in that week 1 game against Cleveland while Cleveland was playing keep up. Now, that is going to be Kamara's bread and butter. Obviously, we know how good of a pass catcher Alvin Kamara is. In a PPR league, I think we can expect Kamara to rack up some PPR points through the air in this one, and I still think he's going to see a good amount of the work on the ground game as well, with some goal line opportunities here for the Saints. And even if New Orleans doesn't go out there and look like they looked in week 1, obviously, that was against a bad Carolina Panthers team, I still think that Alvin Kamara is going to be game script proof here in this matchup against Dallas, and I think he's a player that we can plug in as a running back 1 in our fantasy football leagues. Now, the other running back that you should be starting here this week is going to be J.K. Dobbins of the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, he gets to play on the road at the Carolina Panthers, so we just kind of talked about that matchup as well. Last week for Dobbins, he tallied up 135 rushing yards and a touchdown on 10 carries in a 22-10 win over the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, this matchup against Carolina, it's going to be easy sledding for the Chargers run game. It's probably going to be easy sledding for anybody against Carolina this year, but like I said, last week they allowed a whopping 32.2 fantasy points to the running backs in their week 1 blowout against the Saints. Nothing has changed between last week and now. This is a bad team. They will continue to be a bad team and a bad defense all around. Expect Dobbins to continue to get used in this running game, and I expect Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman to continue leaning on it, especially in a game where Los Angeles is projected to win this one and be leading throughout the majority majority of the game as well. With that being said, if you drafted J.K. Dobbins late, it looks like you might have found a little bit of a gem in your fantasy football drafts, and I think we can plug him in our lineups here this week as a running back 2 in those leagues. But now let's move on to my must-sit players. We are going to be starting it off at the wide receiver position, just like we did with the must-starts. We are going to talk about George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he plays a game on the road at the Denver Broncos. Last week, Pickens caught 6 passes for 85 yards in a Steelers Week 1 victory at the Falcons. He also had 1 rushing attempt that went for negative 10 yards. Now, this week's matchup, even though you look at this Broncos defense and you say, as a whole, they aren't really a great football team, it's still going to be a tough matchup here for George Pickens. He is going to be shadowed by one of the league's best cornerbacks in Pat Surtain. It is going to be a very tough matchup. Last week, Surtain held DK Metcalf in check, so I kind of expect a little bit more of the same here for George Pickens. I think Surtain is going to be a problem for most wide receivers that he faced, especially when we were talking about wide receivers like George Pickens, who are in low passing volume offenses like the Steelers. And not to mention, this is also the lowest projected game total of the weekend, so sportsbooks are also projecting that there are going to be very few points here in this matchup. So you're probably going to be looking to sit George Pickens. If you have to play George Pickens, which I'm trying to look at other options, he is most likely just going to be a low-end wide receiver 3 for us here this week, which I guess in some leagues could have low flex value for you. Now let's move on to another wide receiver I want to talk about. We're going to talk about Jaxon Smith-Njigba for the Seattle Seahawks. He plays a game on the road at the New England Patriots, and last week JSN, he caught 2 of 2 targets for 19 yards in the Seahawks 26-20 win over the Denver Broncos. Now the issue here is that Jaxon Smith-Njigba, as much as we like him, as much as we think he is talented, he is still working behind Tyler Lockett in this offense. Not to mention, this week's matchup for JSN isn't great either. They're going to be going on the road to Foxborough, which is always a tough matchup, and this matchup has the second lowest projected game total, with the Seahawks favored in this one, so they could be leaning on the run game here in the second half. If this game does go in that direction, the way the Vegas sees this game script going, that does mean it's going to be low scoring with the Seahawks playing with a lead, and if that's the case, we're going to see a lot of Kenneth Walker here in the second quarter. So maybe a better game for Kenneth Walker than it is the receiving options for the Seattle Seahawks, and in the second half, it's probably going to mean a lot less passing volume from Seattle. So if you have to throw Jaxon Smith-Njigba into your lineup this week, my suggestion is probably don't if you can, but that being said, he's most likely just going to be a wide receiver 4 flex at best type of play, and that's just somebody that I'm avoiding here in week 2. Now moving on to my must-sit running backs, we're going to start it off with Javonte Williams for the Denver Broncos. As I mentioned, they are going to be playing here this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and last week Javonte, he took 8 carries for 23 yards in the Broncos 26-20 loss against the Seahawks. He also caught 1 of 2 targets for 0 yards receiving, and this week's matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers is going to be a tough one for him. Pittsburgh looked really good last week, especially on the defensive line, and as I mentioned with George Pickens earlier, this game has the lowest projected game total of the weekend, and Denver is projected to lose, which means it's going to be a worse game script for Javonte Williams because they will be playing from behind. Now obviously all of that is going to be bad for Javonte Williams, but I think the worst thing for that, and what we saw from last week, was he only played 52% of the snaps, and Jaleel McLaughlin looked to be involved a lot, especially as a receiver. So not only is this a bad matchup for Javonte Williams, but he is likely also going to be on a bad offense in a committee here this week, and it is going to be a low scoring game. So Javonte Williams, it doesn't look bright in week 2, and he's a player that is best left on your bench. And now moving on to my final running back you can bench this week, it is going to be Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders. He plays on the road at the Baltimore Ravens, and last week Zamir tallied 44 rushing yards on 13 carries in the Raiders' 22-10 loss to the Los Angeles Chargers, and he caught both of his targets for 2 yards. Now this week's matchup versus Baltimore, it is going to be horrible for Zamir White. Not only do the Raiders have to go on the road and play a tough Baltimore defense, but it is also the largest point spread of the weekend, with Baltimore as a heavy favorite in this one. So Zamir, he had a major problem staying on the field in week 1 when the Raiders were trailing, and he was completely replaced by Alexander Mattison down the stretch, with Mattison seeing 60% of the snaps to Zamir White's 38% of the snaps. The problem with Zamir is he's not going to be seeing really any of the work in the receiving game, and Mattison is just the better back when this team is going to be trailing in football games, and both of those are going to be the case here for the Raiders in week 2. Zamir is a running back that we faded in the offseason for reasons like this, and he does look like he is going to be a very, very risky running back for your fantasy football rosters moving forward. But even just looking here at this week 2 matchup against Baltimore, this is a running back that I refuse to put in my starting lineup. So there you have it. Those are my 8 must start and must sit players this week here in week 2. If you did enjoy today's video, go down and hit that like button for me. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, while you're down there, make sure you hit the subscribe button and that notification bell. That way you never miss any future uploads. And last but not least, go make sure to join our Discord. I do have a free Discord linked in the description. I'm in there 24/7, 365, answering start-sit questions, trade questions, waiver questions, anything you got. That is the best place to get advice from me. If you have start-sits for me here today, make sure to drop them in the comments down below. I'll try and answer as many of those as I can. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. Until then, peace out.